Ambassador Ron Dermer, thank you very much for joining us. Tell us, as you now stand in Jerusalem, what the situation is there.
Well, we've had a very rough few days. Hamas, the terror organization that rules Gaza, has fired, at this point, over 1,600 rockets at Israel. Several hundred have been fired at Tel Aviv, I should say. And we're involved in operations in order to restore security to the people of Israel, because we've had millions of Israelis who've been forced to go to bomb shelters repeatedly. We've had hundreds of thousands who've been forced to sleep in bomb shelters. And so we have to do whatever we have to do in order to protect and to defend our citizens, to protect their security, as any other country would demand of its government. And in doing so, what we're doing is exacting a very heavy price on Hamas for their actions and their decisions. We do that by taking out terrorists, which we have, several senior people, senior Hamas terrorists. We take that by hitting their capabilities very hard as well, taking out a lot of those capabilities, because we want to bring them to the point where they realize that this was a big mistake and that they think not twice or 3 times, but 10 times about doing something like this against Israel in the future. So we're involved in that operation as we speak. A siren can go off during this interview, for all I know. Jerusalem was hit at the beginning. Rockets were fired at Jerusalem at the beginning of this round. At any moment, they could fire rockets towards here. But the Israeli people are backing their government and doing what is necessary in order to restore their security.
We know that you are very close to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Have you had conversations with him about his conversations with President Biden?
I have had conversations with him. I didn't speak to him about his latest conversation with President Biden. You know, they've known each other for a very long time, some 30, 40 years. And our hope and our expectation is that the U.S. administration will continue to back Israel's right to defend itself, and would frankly not draw a moral equivalence between Israel and a terror organization. I'd ask the American people, how would they like it if a foreign government was drawing moral equivalence between the United States and ISIS, or the United States and Al-Qaeda? Hamas is a terror organization. It is recognized as such by the United States, by the European Union, and even within the Arab world, it is recognized as a terror organization. So it's important to not draw moral equivalence and to give Israel the backing it needs to do the job we need to do in order to protect our security and to restore this deterrence. And one of those arenas where the United States traditionally does it is by giving Israel solid backing at the United Nations. Thus far, that has happened with the Biden administration, and I hope that that continues.
We also know that Hamas is backed by Iran. The Biden administration has been much more conciliatory towards Iran than the previous administration of this country. Are you communicating that message to the Biden administration? Are you concerned about the Biden administration's approach to Iran?
We're definitely very concerned about that approach, and we implored them ever since the elections, when the incoming Biden administration, in the weeks before they took over, we implored them, and we continue to implore them, to not return to this nuclear deal, which is very, very dangerous. It does not block Iran's path to the bomb. Frankly, if there was a deal on the table that would block Iran's path to the bomb, Israel would be the first country in the world to support it, because we have the most to gain from that, because Iran is a regime that vows and works to destroy the state of Israel. So any deal that would prevent them from having the weapons they need to achieve that goal would be embraced by Israel. The reason why we didn't support the deal in 2015 and why we oppose returning to that deal in 2021 is that that's not what the deal does. The deal puts restrictions on Iran's nuclear program for several years, and those restrictions are automatically removed. And then Iran doesn't have to sneak in or break into the nuclear club. They can just walk into the nuclear club. So it is a very, very big mistake to go back into the nuclear deal and to give up on the sanctions. The sanctions have been very important in ensuring security in the Middle East. It has starved the terrorist regime of Iran of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that would otherwise go to fuel their campaign of carnage and conquest in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Gaza, and everywhere else in the region. You mentioned that Hamas is backed by Iran. Absolutely. Islamic Jihad is the other terror organization in Gaza that is firing rockets. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of Iran. Their officials boast that Iran is giving them not only the money, but the expertise to launch all these rockets at Israel. and Hamas is backed for Iran. So it is very important to stand with Israel against Hamas, and it's very important to not be conciliatory, to not pursue the path of appeasement with Iran. The pressure campaign against Iran was working. It is simply not the case to say that it wasn't working. It had starved the Iranian regime of so much money that would be used to fuel their terrorism. In addition to that, the decision of President Trump, which is now well over a year ago, to take out the leading terrorist in the world, Qasem Soleimani, also made the region safer. But it's important to remember, and I hope that the people who are watching will understand this, the maximum pressure campaign was not in place from the day that President Trump took office. It took him a year and a half to get out of the nuclear deal in May 2018. It took him an additional year before they removed all the waivers that allowed Iran to sell oil. So the maximum pressure campaign was really in place in May 2019. And it had about 18 months to work, and it has decimated the Iranian economy. And they were really choking this regime under the weight of those sanctions. But they had one hope. And everybody knows this. And our intel agencies know this, and American intel agencies know this. You know what their hope was? That help was on the way, that the U.S. would change their policy, that the U.S. would remove the sanctions. And you know why they hoped that? Because that's what the incoming Biden administration was telling them. They said we're going to go back into the nuclear deal. They said that we're going to remove the sanctions. So I think it would be a huge mistake to go back to the nuclear deal. We hope that the Biden administration will not make such a mistake. It will be bad for Israel's security. It will be bad for the security of your Arab partners in the region. And frankly, it will be bad for peace. Let's remember that a policy of confronting Iran and embracing Israel, you know what it got us? It got us 4 peace agreements with Arab states. If we want to actually advance peace in the region, we should continue those policies.
What you've just communicated to me was also communicated to me in an interview I did last month with General Jack Keane, whom I know you know. And he also said that your intelligence agencies have confirmed that Iran is indeed embarked upon a nuclear weapons program, not nuclear advancement for the purpose of civic energy, but for weapons.
They're building ICBMs to launch medical isotopes into space. They're building underground nuclear bunkers because to advance a peaceful nuclear program. It's ridiculous. Everybody knows that.
And what happens?
Not only do we know it.
So what happens? What happens when Prime Minister Netanyahu communicates that to President Biden? What are the results of those discussions?
Well, we explained to them our position, and the Prime Minister, you know, he knows how to explain himself just fine, and he has made very clear that he thinks that this would be a big mistake. Look, we appreciate the friendship of President Biden. He's been a longtime supporter of the state of Israel, and when we communicate to him, we hope that he will not make this mistake to go back into this nuclear deal. We are saying, Israel, we live in the region. The Arab states, they live in the region too. When Israelis and Arabs are telling you this is a very bad idea, people should pay attention. I know that sometimes the U.S. administration says, you know, our allies want us to go back to the nuclear deal. Well, which allies? Britain, France, Germany? They're in Europe. Your allies in the Middle East tell you this is a very, very dangerous thing. You should not go back to the deal, not remove the pressure on Iran. The Biden administration inherited, essentially, I'll use a poker analogy. They inherited a full house. They have maximum pressure against Iran. When you get dealt a full house out of the gate, you don't actually trade in your 3 aces and be left with a pair of 4s. You're not going to end up being able to negotiate anything.
Let me get back to the immediate situation now with the rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel. There has been recent talk just within the past couple of hours that you're prepared to launch ground incursions into Gaza. Is that true? Has that yet happened?
Well, I don't know that that's true, but I can tell you that any responsible government will not take anything off the table when it comes to protecting their citizens. I don't think
might that include strikes against Iran?
Well, I would say that that's a separate issue. Even though Iran is backing Gaza, I don't think that that issue is connected. The question is, what do we need to do in order to restore security, to bring security to millions of Israelis who are in bomb shelters? And the people of Israel want their government and expect their government to do, just as any people would, to restore that security. I don't think anyone in Israel would like to launch a ground operation. Hopefully, we will be able to do this from the air. Hopefully, we will be able to exact a heavy enough price from Hamas in terms of losing their terrorist personnel, losing their capabilities, that they will be deterred. But I don't think any responsible Israeli government will take any option off the table, if need be, in order to protect their civilians.
And Ambassador Dermer, explain to our American audience here why there are so many civilian casualties in the counterattacks which you've launched against Hamas.
I actually completely disagree with that premise. I don't think there's a lot of civilian casualties at all. I don't know if you saw 15-story buildings falling down. Okay,
I did.
When you go to a city and you see 15-story buildings down, it is shocking that there are so few civilian casualties. If Israel were trying to attack civilians, if we were trying to harm Palestinian civilians, there would not be dozens. There would not be hundreds. There'd be maybe thousands or tens of thousands, because we have that firepower, and we've actually dropped a lot of that firepower on Gaza. We go to lengths that no other country has gone in the history of the world to prevent civilian casualties on the Palestinians. And we're dealing with...
The point I'm trying to make there is that Hamas, to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, places its missile batteries and also its leadership in civilian areas, and that therefore collateral damage is an unfortunate but necessary problem.
You're exactly right. And here's the Hamas strategy. This is what they do. They perpetrate a double war crime. They deliberately target Israel civilians, and they're hoping for as many civilian casualties on the Israeli side as possible. If they kill one, they're happy. If they kill 10, they'll be even happier. If they kill 100, they'd be ecstatic. And in addition, as you just said, they place their weapons, their missiles, their ammunition stores, they put them in civilian areas because they're trying to force us, even with the most surgical of strikes, to actually harm their civilians. That's another war crime. They use their civilians as human shields. And you know what they try to do? This is key to the Hamas strategy. They try to get the international media to blame Israel for those civilian casualties. That's how this game works from their point of view. They don't care about the Palestinian civilian casualties. It helps them advance their goal. And the key to this is not for the media to stop reporting. The media should report everything, but they should blame the Hamas terror organizations that's putting those Palestinian civilians in harm's way. And the responsible governments in the world who make these statements, a lot of times are these statements of moral equivalence between Israel and a terror organization, these ridiculous statements about a cycle of violence. What they should be doing is backing Israel's legitimate right to defend its people. We do not need, I'm telling you, we do not need other people to tell us not to harm civilians. The United States has fought wars thousands of miles away, and you have civilian casualties thousands of miles away at much higher rates than we do. But the difference is America wasn't being targeted day after day by missiles, and you have half of Americans at bomb shelters. We are fighting this war with enormous restraint. We're not perfect. There are civilian casualties, and it's a tragedy every time there is a civilian casualty. No one in Israel is callous to Palestinian civilians. We're the only ones who seem to care about Palestinian civilians. But if the responsible governments of the world want to actually protect the civilians, they back Israel, they tell and they convince Palestinians that this path will get them nowhere. They convince Hamas that you will have no hearing or quarter in the international community if you use your population as human shields.
Let me ask you also about the status of the Arab peace deal that President Trump worked out. What is the condition of that peace deal since the Biden administration has taken office?
Well, I was pleased to hear that the Biden administration, when the deal was made, when he was a candidate, said that he was fully supportive of it. And I believe he is. And I think he would like to see that peace expand. It took us, 30 years to get the first peace that we did with Egypt. And that peace has weathered, thankfully, many storms over 4 decades. It took us then another 15 years to get peace with Jordan. We had to wait 25 years from the second peace to the third peace in 2020 when Israel made peace with the United Arab Emirates. Then we had to wait only a month to get peace with Bahrain. And in short order, we had peace with 2 more countries. What does that tell you? People should ask themselves, how did that happen? The reason why it happened is because there was a strategic opportunity in the region where Arab states understood that Iran is our common enemy, that they wanted to move towards Israel to work for their own security and prosperity. But beyond that, we also had a U.S. administration that had a clear policy: confront Iran, embrace Israel. Remember, the previous administration recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. It said that Israel had legitimate rights, our legal rights, in Judea and Samaria, the heart of our biblical homeland. All of those things, a lot of the elites said that's going to set back the cause of peace. It didn't, because the message it sent to your Arab partners in the region is that if they wanted to get closer to Washington, they should move closer to Jerusalem. And confronting Iran and embracing Israel is the key to actually expanding peace. If the Biden administration does that, and I would encourage them to do it, to continue this strong policy vis-a-vis Iran, to not get back into this dangerous deal, and to embrace Israel, to back its right to defend itself, to signal to the entire world that the United States supports Israel, you will see the advance of peace, just like you did in the past.
And last question for you, Ambassador Dermer. We've seen a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the United States. The epicenter of a lot of this anti-Semitism is on American college campuses, but it's like so many other things which are nurtured on American college campuses is now being filtered out into the society at large. We've seen attacks on Jewish people in New York City in recent days. Your thoughts about this, what's causing it, how to resolve it?
Well, this is actually not just an American problem, it's a global problem, the rise of anti-Semitism. I think, frankly, we had a half a century after the Holocaust where it was politically incorrect to go after Jews in Western society. Anti-Semitism was basically within the Arab world, and it was a product of Soviet propaganda. In the rest of the world, you did not read in polite company. People were embarrassed about being anti-Semitic in the wake of the Holocaust. And a lot of Jews hoped, and a lot of people of goodwill hoped, that this was a new normal, but it wasn't. What we have is a return to the old story of singling the Jewish people out. You know, the Holocaust has in a certain sense blinded us to all the anti-Semitism that came before it, because it was such a seismic event. It's such an awful, horrific event. But for 20 centuries, 25 centuries before the Holocaust, you had nonstop anti-Semitism. So now we're returning to the historical norm. What is happening is a lot of this anti-Semitism is masked behind a hatred for Israel, where Israel is demonized. It's held to a different standard than any other country in the world. They deny Israel the right to exist. Alone among nations in the world, we don't have a right to exist. And we have to forcefully oppose it. And thankfully, you have in American leaders on both sides of the aisle, people who will forcefully condemn anti-Semitism. And it's very important that people will condemn anti-Semitism on their side of the aisle, whether it's coming from the left or it's coming from the right. And I'm pleased that American leaders do that by and large, and I would ask them to continue. But there is a big difference. One last thing. There is a big difference between the anti-Semitism of the past and the anti-Semitism of today. And the big difference is the Jewish people have power. In those centuries, we had no power to fight our enemies. Today, the Jewish people have power in the Jewish state to fight against their enemies. And we are blessed with friends throughout the United States who support Israel, who fight against anti-Semitism with us. And I want to thank all of you who are those friends who are watching for that strong support. And hopefully they will support Israel and continue to support Israel in these critical days ahead.
Ambassador Ron Dermer, former ambassador from Israel to the United States of America, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.